This is briefing 12 on the scope of the global strategy, and thank you for joining me for yet another briefing on dialogue with strategic purpose. Those of you who have followed the entire course so far will remember that in the initial briefings I set out the purpose of the course, and then in a number of presentations discussed dialogue as a necessary next step, not only in the implementation of the European Global Strategy, but maybe for EU external action as a whole. In the last briefing, I recapitulated some of the arguments pro and con for developing the global strategy. Before going into the 5 main priorities of the strategy, I now want to discuss a bit more the scope of it, which, as you will remember, is foreign and security policy. Referring to the summary of this briefing, I will note that foreign policy is not just external action, but also the nexus internal-external policy. Secondly, that security used to be an implicit concept before CFSP and CSDP. Third, in addition to the obvious statement that many issues not explicitly framed as security issues also may influence security, something that often conveniently is forgotten. Fourth, that the Lisbon Treaty meant a breakthrough in making much of this more explicit. And then I note that the EU institutions before Brexit were somewhat cautious in developing this discourse. You can observe that the European army debate, although somewhat present before the Brexit referendum, certainly has become more explicit after the results were registered. Then I assume that this has been done in order not to influence domestic political situations in a counterproductive way. You could see a similar effort to be cautious when the Irish referendum on the Lisbon Treaty took place in 2008 and 2009, by the way. The lack of legal basis to discuss security explicitly also constrained the development of a comprehensive approach for a long time. A case in point is border management. Mentioning its role in supporting counterterrorism was long taboo, although this link is fairly obvious to me. All of this has hampered efforts to create overview. Serious progress in this regard has essentially been forced by crisis. One of the first examples was obviously 9/11, when the heads of state and government ordered for the first time a real inventory of EU assets in support of counterterrorism and security. And it is in crisis, such as Ukraine, that battle about competencies has somewhat given way to serious analysis of who can do what best inside and outside the EU institutions, including in other international organizations. Still, actions summarized in Council conclusions in crisis situations often tend to repackage already existing programs under adapted titles. Obviously, real innovation in crisis requires extensive contingency planning before crisis, including exercises. This has been very obvious in military planning, but it's been very slow in gaining traction on the community side, something that is now finally happening, at least in the context of emergency response. Humanitarian assistance, by the way, is one of the few areas where the European Commission for a very long time has learned to work in a crisis mode as a standard operating procedure. But let me now go back in the summary list of items and say a little bit more about the obvious fact that if you have a more comprehensive concept of security, many types of activities which are not explicitly security related still must be regarded as important for security. The Lisbon Treaty was no doubt a breakthrough in developing an explicit discourse inside the institutions on both foreign and security policy. By mentioning the concept of security more than 100 times in the Treaty of Lisbon, this has helped to make explicit an area which was often treated as almost taboo in the EU, not to cause domestic political problems on the level of EU member states. This is nothing surprising. Already Jacques Delors was relatively pessimistic about the possibility to develop CFSP and even more CSDP as a real new vector of EU integration. In the recent years, several parallel developments have contributed to make the discourse on security more explicit in the EU. I noted that myself when I started writing my handbook on EU and security in 2012, interviewing a lot of people inside and outside the EU institutions. Most people were still under the impression that the only thing that leaders could really focus on at the time was a financial crisis, which was not primarily framed in security terms. But then, of course, Ukraine, migration, terrorism, as well as a number of other security-related problems started to change the way the European Council dealt with security. There was still a problem of multitasking, of course. There was still a tendency to focus on one issue at a time, and something which was on top of the agenda during one meeting could then just a few weeks later disappear, also as regards media attention. And then the concern for domestic political opinion inside a number of EU member states, in particular the United Kingdom, which for a long time led to a certain caution on the part of European leaders when discussing security in the EU. This has now given way to more drastic proposals, and the European Army proposal, which I mentioned, is one of them. It may be, of course, that the election in the United States, which illustrates that Europe probably will need to take more responsibility for its own security in the future, also has a role in this. So foreign and security policy is the formal scope of the global strategy. It is intergovernmental and requires consensus decisions in the Council of Ministers. That's the formality of it. But Article 21 of the Treaty of the European Union sets out the notion of external action as something much more than that. It mentions key community policy contexts such as development, enlargement, trade, etc. In most of these areas, the Commission has a lead in the EU, and in those areas it is the High Representative in her capacity as Vice President of the European Commission who acts as a coordinator of one of the clusters of commissioners set up by the incumbent President of the Commission, Juncker. And in crisis, you can expect the European Council to take an overall view which goes even beyond the global strategy, as exemplified by the Council conclusions on Ukraine some years back, which were very broad and even very specific in terms of financial implications. Council conclusions also on the highest level sometimes do require very specific responsibilities for member states, although this is slow, to say the least, in being implemented when it comes to sharing responsibilities in the area of migration. What is now obvious is that non-members of the European Union, including the United Kingdom, whenever there is a political will to do so, might in the future even share such responsibilities. I would not be surprised. I will come back to the notion of who is we in the global strategy. When the global strategy talks about our responsibility or we, it does over 200 times in the document, this is not obvious to the reader. And what does it mean? Who is we? The fact that this is not defined has probably to do with the lack of clarity on who is actually the implementing actor in each specific context. Sometimes member states will unite in giving the European institutions a strong role, a strong mandate to do things. But in other situations, there will be most likely in the future a stronger focus on the member state role. This does, however, not diminish the need for strategy. One can see it very clearly in crisis situations, that if there has not been a sufficient level of contingency planning on the strategic level before a specific crisis has occurred, then European reaction will be reactive. It may then have to consist of summarizing what is already underway, repackaging already existing programs, and describing links between different types of policies in an abstract and non-operational way. For instance, when discussing an internal security problem, if the link to external action has not been clarified in advance of the crisis, the result may be a simple reference to future follow-up in the domain of external action. To a large extent, this was exactly what happened when European Justice and Interior Ministers led the EU response both to irregular migration and to terrorism from 2015 onwards. There were a lot of references to addressing the root causes, and there was the odd reference to the forthcoming global strategy, but it was probably not clear to those who read the conclusions of the Council what that exactly meant. A more thorough analysis would, I assume, have possibly developed a clear link to the implementation of Agenda 2030, the Millennium Goals in the new form, as adopted by the United Nations, and made more explicit quite a number of efforts to address root causes. To be very frank about it, would have made it obvious to people that implementation of Agenda 2030 is not just being nice or ethical in EU external action, but even more to act in the interest of the European Union and its member states. With more strategic planning and the external action service on the level that existed during the last decade, one could possibly have done more to make the external agenda more concrete. This does not take away the need, of course, to implement the commitments that have been undertaken on the level of the member states. I will, of course, come back to this, but repackaging already existing initiatives in crisis situations is not the best possible thing that the EU can do. Still, this is what has happened time and again. It happened during 9/11, which caught not only the United States but also Europe with surprise. It happened during the tsunami in 2004, which illustrated the lack of capabilities to help out in a serious way on the European level. It happened during the Fukushima catastrophe in 2010-11, which had many of the characteristics of a multi-sector crisis. It may happen again, for instance, as a result of health epidemic, a breakdown of critical infrastructure, etc. And when it does, it is of course important that the EU and Europe is prepared in terms of explicit strategies, following on to the global strategy and explicit contingency planning.